My husband needed a ramp. The HOA said no. Then Karen blocked every permit I filed. She smiled while my husband cried in his chair. I begged me instead. 6 months later, I stopped begging. Turns out Karen had a secret of her own. So I poured concrete straight through her front yard. My name is Maggie Turner, 34, married to Daniel for 9 years. We bought our house in Willowbrook Estates before the accident that put him in a wheelchair. I work part-time as a school nurse, juggling shifts around his physical therapy. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Quiet mornings, coffee on the porch, the two of us figuring out a new normal together. One step at a time. Willowbrook was supposed to be our fresh start. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, a community that advertised itself as family-friendly and inclusive on its glossy welcome brochure. We trusted that. Resident Karen Ashcroft ran the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and that inclusion apparently had an asterisk, one that excluded anyone whose needs didn't match her idea of curb appeal. Karen Ashcroft had been HOA president for 11 years. Neighbors joked that she'd been elected the same year democracy died on our street. Nobody ran against her twice after the first person who tried found their fence in violation within a week. She wore blazers to backyard barbecues and carried a clipboard like a badge of office. People smiled at her. Nobody trusted her. Our first HOA meeting was 6 weeks after we moved in. Karen stood at the podium reciting bylaws like scripture, mailbox height, approved paint swatches, grass length measured, apparently to the 1/4 inch. She welcomed us warmly, shook my hand a beat too long, and told me Willowbrook took pride in protecting property values through consistency. I didn't yet know what that phrase would cost us. Daniel's accident happened 8 months after we settled in. A ladder, a slick roof, a fall that shattered 2 vertebrae. The hospital called it incomplete paralysis, some feeling, no reliable strength below the waist. The doctors were optimistic about therapy. I was optimistic about everything back then. I didn't know optimism wouldn't be enough to get my husband up our own front steps. We came home to a house that no longer fit him. 3 steps to the porch, narrow door frames, a bathroom he couldn't wheel into. I remember watching him stare up at those steps from his wheelchair in the driveway, jaw tight, saying nothing, while I fumbled with a borrowed ramp too short and too steep to be anything but a temporary insult. I called a contractor within the week. A permanent ramp, aluminum rails, sloped correctly, code compliant, quietly built along the side of the house where it wouldn't even be visible from the street. Simple. I assumed the HOA existed for things like broken fences and unpaid dues, not for standing between my husband and his own front door. I submitted the request through the HOA's online portal, attaching Daniel's medical documentation and the contractor's specs. The confirmation email promised a decision within 30 days. I marked my calendar, told Daniel it would be fine, and went back to focusing on physical therapy schedules, insurance calls, and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding a life around a wheelchair. 30 days passed. I called the HOA office and got a board assistant who said, Karen handles all modification requests personally, in a tone that suggested this was somehow supposed to reassure me. I asked when Karen might have an answer. The assistant laughed softly, like I'd asked something naive, and said, "When she's ready." I finally caught Karen in person at the mailbox kiosk. Clipboard in hand as always. I introduced myself properly, explained the ramp, explained Daniel. She nodded along with practiced sympathy, the kind reserved for people she'd already decided not to help. "I've seen the file," she said. "We have concerns about precedent." I didn't understand yet what precedent had to do with my husband's spine. That night, I looked up Willowbrook's bylaws myself. Buried in Section 14 was a line about architectural modifications visible from any adjoining property, vague enough to justify almost anything Karen wanted. I texted a neighbor, Priya, asking if this was normal. She replied within a minute. "Everything with Karen is normal until it's used specifically. Then it's a whole production." Priya filled me in over coffee 2 days later. Karen had denied a swing set, delayed a wheelchair lift for old Mr. Halvorsen for 4 months, and once fined a family $80 for a garden gnome she called aesthetically inconsistent. Nobody fought her, Priya said, because fighting Karen meant fines. Lien. And a level of pettiness most people didn't have the stamina for. "Why does everyone let her get away with it?" I asked. Priya shrugged, stirring her coffee. "Because she's on every committee. She knows every loophole. And she's got Trent and Marlene on the board eating out of her hand. You go against her. She doesn't just say no. She makes your life a hobby." I laughed it off. I decided to be reasonable. I emailed Karen a follow-up, attaching an ADA fact sheet about reasonable accommodations for disabled homeowners, careful to keep the tone polite, non-confrontational, almost apologetic for needing to ask twice. Her reply came 4 days later, 3 curt lines, thanking me for my patience, while the board continued reviewing the request in due course. Meanwhile, Daniel was using the borrowed ramp daily, wheels catching on its warped plywood edge. One bad afternoon nearly tipping him sideways into the flower bed. I caught him that time. Every morning he left for therapy on that ramp felt like a small negotiation with disaster, and every week of Karen's silence made that negotiation worse. I brought it up again at the next open HOA session, standing at the public comment microphone with my hands shaking more than I expected. I described the ramp, the specs, the medical necessity, keeping my voice level. Karen listened with her chin propped on one hand, then said the board would take it under advisement, a phrase I was starting to recognize as a closed door dressed as an open one. Driving home that night, Daniel asked how the meeting went. I told him the truth, nothing, again. He was quiet for a while, then said, "Maybe it's not us. Maybe it's her. Her could dislike us enough to block a ramp out of nothing." So I told him he was overthinking it. I was wrong about that too. The denial letter arrived on a Tuesday, printed on HOA letterhead. 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language boiling down to one sentence. The modification request was denied for failing to meet community aesthetic standards. No mention of ADA. No mention of Daniel's medical file, which I'd attached twice. Just aesthetics. As if my husband's mobility were a matter of curb appeal. I called the HOA office, voice tighter than I intended, and asked to speak with Karen directly. She came on the line almost too quickly, like she'd been expecting the call. "Mrs. I understand you're frustrated," she said, before I'd said a word. "But rules exist for a reason. We can't have every homeowner building whatever structure they feel entitled to. Entitled, I repeated. This is a wheelchair ramp for my husband. Karen's tone didn't shift an inch. I sympathize. Truly. But if we allow non-standard structures for medical reasons, we open the door for everyone to claim a medical reason. I asked if she was seriously comparing my husband's spinal injury to someone wanting a hot tub. She said she'd note my tone for the file. I hung up shaking, more from disbelief than anger. Daniel watched me from the kitchen table, his face unreadable in the way it had become since the accident, guarding himself against disappointment before it could land. Told you, he said quietly. It's not the ramp. An answer for that. I still don't like how close to true it felt. I appealed in writing, citing the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provisions, copying language directly from a disability rights website. Karen's response came from the HOA's attorney instead of her this time. Cold, formal letter stating the board would revisit the matter upon submission of additional documentation. A euphemism. I was learning. For keep providing paperwork we will keep losing. That week I mentioned the situation to my sister, Denise, paralegal 2 states away. She went quiet on the phone, then said, Maggie, that's not how this works. HOAs can't override federal disability accommodation law like that. I told her I knew, in theory, but knowing a law existed and having the money or energy to force someone to follow it were very different things. I resubmitted with everything, updated medical letters, contractor blueprints, a formal accommodation request citing the FHA by name, and a photo of Daniel struggling on the temporary ramp. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office myself, watching the assistant slide it into a folder already 3 inches thick with what I now understood was months of my own paperwork. Ignored and refiled. 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived. Not a denial, not an approval, but notice of a special hardship hearing, scheduled a full 6 weeks out, requiring Daniel's physical presence to verify the nature of the disability before the board. I stared at that line for a long time. They wanted my husband, freshly injured, wheeled in front of strangers to prove he deserved a ramp. I called Karen again, angrier this time, asking why Daniel needed to appear in person when his medical documentation was already exhaustive. Board policy requires it for hardship exceptions, she said smoothly. I asked how many other hardship requests had required in-person hearings. There was a pause just half a second too long before she said, I don't have those numbers in front of me. Priya heard about the hearing requirement and went pale. She's never done that before, she said. Not for anyone. His backyard shed dispute. That was the first moment I let myself wonder, seriously, whether this was really about aesthetics at all, or whether Karen Ashcroft had decided, for reasons of her own, that our family was the one she'd make an example of. Daniel didn't want to go to the hearing. I'm not a circus act, he said flatly, wheeling himself out onto the porch to avoid the conversation. I understood. How to dress himself, transfer to a car, exist in public without people's eyes sliding away in discomfort. Now a woman with a clipboard wanted him paraded in front of a folding table jury. I went to the next general HOA meeting alone, determined to understand what I was actually up against. I watched Karen run the room, cutting off a man mid-sentence about drainage complaints, praising a woman's new shutters unprompted, correcting the secretary's minutes twice. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was performing control, and everyone in that room had learned to applaud along. After the meeting, an older man named Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. He'd fought Karen over a driveway extension 2 years earlier and lost. Badly, fines, a lean threat, eventually surrender. She doesn't forget people who push back, he warned. And she doesn't lose. Because she outlasts you. I thanked him. I didn't yet believe him fully. That night I dug through old HOA meeting minutes posted in the community shared drive, curious what hardship hearings had looked like historically. I found exactly one. For years earlier, for a homeowner requesting a stair lift, approved in writing within 2 weeks. No in-person appearance required. The inconsistency sat in my stomach like a stone. This wasn't policy, aimed at us specifically. I brought the old minutes to Priya, half hoping she'd tell me I was imagining a pattern. Instead, she frowned at the screen for a long moment and said, "That's Trent's aunt. Karen and Trent are close." The implication landed slowly. Favors flowed one way in Willowbrook, and Daniel and I clearly weren't on the side of the ledger that received them. I emailed the board directly this time, not just Karen, copying every listed member with the old approval on record and a pointed question. Why did our hardship request require a hearing when a comparable case hadn't? Only one board member, a quiet woman named Angela, replied a single line, and signed from her official account, "Ask Karen about the contractor bids sometime." I didn't understand Angela's message yet, but I saved it. Something in its careful vagueness told me it mattered. That somewhere behind the aesthetic language and hardship hearings was a reason far more concrete than Karen's supposed love of curb appeal. For the first time since the denial letter, I stopped feeling like a homeowner filling out paperwork and started feeling like I was investigating something. The hardship hearing arrived. And against his own wishes, Daniel came. I watched him grip the wheels of his chair as we entered the community clubhouse. Jaw set, refusing to let anyone see how much this cost him. Karen sat at the head of a folding table flanked by Trent and Marlene. 3 homeowners in metal chairs like a tribunal deciding whether my husband's body was legitimate. Karen opened by reading our file aloud. Clinically, as though Daniel weren't sitting 3 feet away. She asked him to describe his level of functional impairment, for the record. Daniel answered in short, controlled sentences, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to be fishing for. I watched her scribble notes, unmoved, and felt something in me shift from frustration into something colder. Trent asked whether Daniel could eventually use the front steps with therapy, as if permanence were a technicality to be waited out. Daniel said his prognosis wasn't certain, and that was exactly why the ramp mattered now, not hypothetically later. Karen wrote that down too. Expression unreadable, and I understood she wasn't gathering facts. She was building a file to justify a decision she'd already made. To the end, Karen announced the board would deliberate and issue a written decision, offering no timeline. Daniel wheeled out of that clubhouse in silence, and I drove us home with my hands too tight on the wheel, replaying every clinical, dehumanizing question. That night he didn't cry, which somehow felt worse than if he had. He just stared at the ceiling and said nothing for a long time. The written decision came 10 days later, Denied. Again. This time citing insufficient demonstration of permanent necessity, alongside the original aesthetic objection. I read it twice, then a third time, hunting for anything resembling reasoning. There was none. Only bureaucratic phrasing wrapped around a decision Karen had clearly reached before Daniel ever wheeled through that clubhouse door to answer her questions. I called a disability rights attorney that same afternoon, a woman named Renata who listened to the whole story without interrupting, then said flatly, "This is textbook FHA violation territory. HOAs cannot deny reasonable modifications for disabled residents based on aesthetics." Relief and rage hit me at once. Relief that I wasn't imagining it. Rage that it had taken this long to hear someone say it plainly. Renata explained our options: a formal FHA complaint, a demand letter, potentially litigation, all of which cost money and months we didn't have while Daniel kept using a ramp that could genuinely hurt him. I asked what she'd do in my position. She said, "I'd send the demand letter first. Sometimes people like Karen back down the moment lawyers get involved." I wanted to believe that. We sent the demand letter within the week, laying out the FHA violations in plain legal language, requesting immediate approval within 15 business days. I felt a flicker of hope mailing it, imagining Karen reading it and finally, quietly, folding. I didn't yet understand that people like her don't fold when confronted. They dig in harder, and they make sure you regret making them feel cornered. Karen's response arrived not from her but from the HOA's insurance-appointed attorney. A clipped letter disputing the FHA's applicability to voluntary community associations and threatening to countersue for harassment of board members if we continued escalating. Renata read it and laughed. Not kindly. "That's a bluff dressed up in letterhead," she said. "But it means she's scared enough to lawyer up fast." Being scared didn't make Karen careful, though. Within days, a citation appeared in our mailbox for an unrelated violation. Our trash cans left visible 18 minutes past the posted collection window. A rule I hadn't even known existed with that level of specificity. The timing wasn't subtle. This was retaliation dressed as routine enforcement, and everyone on our street seemed to recognize it instantly. Priya texted a photo of her own mailbox that same week, a citation for a flag holder installed without prior architectural approval, despite the same flag holder having hung there, unremarked, for 3 years. She'd made the mistake of publicly agreeing with me at the last meeting. Karen's message was unmistakable. Support the Turners, and your file gets open too. I started keeping a folder, every citation, every email, every inconsistency between what the bylaws said and what Karen enforced. Denise, my sister, called it building a paper trail, the kind of unglamorous documentation that wins cases nobody wants to fight. I didn't feel triumphant collecting it. I felt tired, and increasingly certain that reasoning with Karen had never been a real option. Daniel, meanwhile, started avoiding the front of the house altogether, using the garage door instead, its awkward side entry ramp jarring but at least private from watching neighbors. I caught him one evening struggling to maneuver around a stack of boxes we hadn't moved yet, and something in his frustrated silence broke something in me. This wasn't about property values anymore. This was about our home refusing to hold him. At the next HOA meeting, I stood at the public microphone again, this time reading portions of the FHA aloud, along with the timeline of citations that had appeared only after we escalated. Karen interrupted twice, citing meeting decorum, but I kept going, watching a few neighbors' faces shift from polite disinterest to something more attentive. Not everyone in that room loved Karen as much as she assumed. After the meeting, Angela, the quiet board member who'd sent that cryptic email, approached me in the parking lot, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "I can't say much," she whispered, "but look into who Karen's brother-in-law is, and ask about the preferred contractor list before you hire anyone else." Then she walked away fast, like she regretted saying even that much. I went home and searched the HOA's contractor recommendation page, something I'd skimmed past before assuming it was just a helpful list. One name stood out: Ashcroftane Construction, listed as the community's certified preferred provider for all approved modifications, including ramps. My stomach dropped as the pieces started, slowly, to align into something far uglier than mere bureaucratic pettiness. A quick public records search confirmed it. Ashcroftane Construction was co-owned by Marcus Dane, Karen's brother-in-law. Every approved modification in Willowbrook for the past 6 years had gone through his company, at prices Priya later confirmed were nearly double standard market rate. Karen wasn't protecting aesthetics. She was protecting a pipeline, and our independent contractor threatened to cut her family out of the profit. I brought this to Renata, who went quiet on the phone for a moment before saying carefully, "That's a conflict of interest, potentially actionable on its own, separate from the FHA claim." I asked if we could prove it. She said we needed more than a hunch: invoices, communications, something showing Karen had steered decisions toward her brother-in-law's company. The hunt for evidence had officially begun. Priya, turned out, had fought her own quiet battle over a fence 2 years earlier and still had the paperwork. Her approved fence had used Ashcroftane at a price 30% above the quote from her own contractor, after her original permit was mysteriously delayed for months. She dug the invoices out of a filing cabinet that night and handed them to me like evidence for a trial. I compared Priya's paperwork against 3 other neighbors' modification files, all shared willingly once they understood what I suspected. The pattern held every time: independent contractor requests delayed or denied, Ashcroftane requests approved within days. It wasn't proof of criminal fraud, Renata cautioned, but it was a clear, documentable pattern of favoritism benefiting Karen's own family financially, hidden behind a wall of aesthetic language. Karen, unaware how much ground we'd covered, escalated again. A formal notice threatening a lien on our home over unpaid administrative review fees for the ramp request, a charge invented, as far as Renata could tell, out of nothing resembling the actual bylaws. It felt less like enforcement now and more like Karen testing exactly how far she could push before we broke. I called Renata in a panic about the lien threat. She reviewed the bylaws herself and confirmed no such fee existed anywhere in Willowbrook's governing documents. "This isn't just aggressive," she said. "This is fabricated. We have grounds to go on offense instead of just defending the ramp request." For the first time, I felt the balance of power tilt slightly. That week, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. No name, just a forwarded thread showing Karen instructing the HOA's office assistant to slow walk our file specifically, phrased almost casually, like delaying a disabled man's ramp request was an ordinary administrative task. I didn't know who'd sent it, but Renata said it might be admissible, and more importantly, It confirmed everything we already suspected. I asked Angela directly, carefully. Over coffee she insisted on paying for whether she'd sent it. She neither confirmed nor denied, only said, "Some of us have watched Karen do this to people for years and couldn't say anything because she controls who gets approved for anything in this neighborhood. You're the first person with enough evidence that it might actually matter." I believed her. Angela quietly confirmed something else that afternoon. The board's supposed unanimous votes on our denials weren't actually unanimous. She and one other member had abstained both times. But Karen recorded the minutes as unanimous anyway, banking on nobody ever cross-checking board attendance against vote tallies. It was a small lie, but small lies, stacked high enough, build an entire fraudulent record. Renata requested the official meeting minutes and attendance logs through a formal HOA records request, a right every homeowner technically had, though Karen had clearly never expected anyone to exercise it. The office stalled for 2 weeks before finally producing documents that, cross-referenced with Angela's account, confirmed the discrepancy. Karen had falsified board vote records, not once, but at least twice regarding our ramp. I felt something shift in myself around this point. Less desperate homeowner begging for accommodation, more person quietly assembling a case. Daniel noticed the change too. "You look like you're winning something," he said one night, watching me organize files at the kitchen table. "I don't know if we're winning yet," I told him. "But I know exactly what she's been hiding now." Karen, seemingly sensing something had shifted, invited me to a private conversation at her house, framed as an olive branch, a chance to resolve this like neighbors without further HOA involvement. Renata warned me not to go alone and not to sign anything. I agreed to the meeting but brought a small recorder in my pocket, a decision that would matter far more than I expected. Karen's house was immaculate in a way that felt performative. Matching throw pillows, a wall of framed community beautification awards. Not a single photograph suggesting an actual family lived there beyond the polished surfaces. She offered tea I didn't drink and opened with a long, practiced monologue about protecting the community's character before finally getting to what she actually wanted, which was for me to withdraw the FHA complaint. "I can approve the ramp quietly," Karen said, leaning forward. "If you agree, there's no need to involve lawyers or make a fuss at meetings." I asked why quiet approval hadn't been possible 8 months earlier. She smiled thinly and said, "Things get complicated once people start making accusations." I didn't correct her that the accusations were simply documented facts. I let her keep talking. She kept talking, and it was worth every uncomfortable minute. She admitted, almost boastfully, that she steered a few projects toward Marcus's company because, "At least I know the work gets done right," framing blatant favoritism as quality control. My recorder caught every word. I nodded along, playing agreeable, while internally cataloging exactly how much rope she was handing me. Unprompted, one sentence at a time. On my way out, Karen added one more thing, almost as an afterthought, that I wasn't expecting. "You'd be surprised how many people around here need accommodations and just don't make a whole production out of it." Something in her tone was strange, defensive in a way that didn't match the rest of her confidence. I filed the comment away, unsure yet what it meant. I gave the recording to Renata that same night. She listened twice, then let out a low whistle. "This is enormously helpful," she said. Admission of favoritism toward a related contractor. On tape, unprompted. Combined with the falsified vote records, we have more than an accommodation complaint now. We might have grounds for a formal ethics complaint against the entire board, not just Karen personally. Emboldened, I decided to look harder into that strange comment about people not making a production out of accommodations. I asked Angela if she knew what Karen meant. Angela hesitated a long moment before saying, quietly, "Ask her about her father sometime. But don't tell her I said that." Another thread, dangling, waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to pull it. I didn't chase that thread immediately, focused instead on the more concrete fight, the falsified minutes, the contractor favoritism, the fabricated fee. Renata drafted a formal complaint to the state's Fair Housing Enforcement Agency alongside a demand for immediate ramp approval, citing everything we'd gathered. Filing it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for months. Karen would receive official notice within the week. Word apparently traveled fast once the state agency contacted the HOA's management company for a response. Priya called me practically breathless. Karen had called an emergency. Closed-door board session. No public notice. Clearly rattled. "She's never done a closed session before," Priya said. "Whatever's in that complaint, it scared her enough to break her own rules for once." 2 days later, an official HOA letter arrived. Approval, at last, for the ramp. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the prior denials. As though 8 months of documented obstruction had simply never happened. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something colder settle in. A certainty that Karen wasn't retreating out of decency. She was regrouping, and people like her rarely regroup quietly. I told Renata about the approval, expecting her to celebrate. Instead, she cautioned patience. Getting the ramp approved doesn't erase the fabricated fees, the falsified minutes, or the favoritism, she said. If anything, watch for retaliation now more than ever. People like this don't like losing, even a little, and they tend to look for somewhere else to make you pay for it. Daniel, though, allowed himself real relief for the first time in months, calling the contractor that same afternoon to schedule the build. Watching him make that call, voice lighter than I'd heard it in a long time, I let myself feel a sliver of hope too, even while some instinct kept whispering that Karen Ashcroft wasn't the type to lose gracefully, or quietly, or for long. The ramp construction began within the week. Contractors measuring and staking the side yard while Daniel watched from the porch with an expression I hadn't seen since before the accident. Something close to anticipation instead of dread. For 3 days, everything in Willowbrook felt almost normal again. I should have known, given everything we'd already learned about Karen, that normal wouldn't last. For a brief stretch, things actually calmed down. No new citations appeared. Karen kept her distance at the mailbox, offering a tight nod instead of her usual clipboard commentary. Priya said the neighborhood grapevine had gone quiet too, like everyone was collectively holding their breath, unsure whether the fight was truly over or simply paused while Karen figured out her next move. The ramp was finished on a bright Saturday morning. Aluminum rails gleaming, slope gentle and code perfect. Exactly what should have taken 30 days and instead took nearly 9 months. Daniel wheeled down it slowly, testing the give of it under his tires. then looked up at me with an expression somewhere between relief and disbelief that it had actually, finally, happened. We invited Priya and a few supportive neighbors over that evening for a small cookout. Nothing fancy, just gratitude wrapped in burgers and lemonade. Frank came too, the man who'd warned me in the parking lot months earlier, and raised his cup toward the ramp. "First time I've seen anyone actually beat her," he said. I told him I wasn't sure we'd beaten anything yet. Daniel started using the front door again for the first time in months, wheeling out each morning to get the mail himself instead of asking me to grab it. It was a small thing, watching him reclaim that tiny independence, but it undid something tight in my chest that had been wound for the better part of a year. I let myself believe, briefly, that this chapter was closing. Renata, meanwhile, kept working quietly in the background, filing follow-up documentation with the state agency regarding the falsified minutes and contractor favoritism, separate from the ramp itself. "The state doesn't just drop these once the immediate issue resolves," she explained. "They can still investigate a pattern of misconduct across the whole board." I hoped, for the community's sake, that they would. I noticed Karen watching our ramp from her car one afternoon, parked at the curb a beat too long before driving off. No confrontation, just observation. I mentioned it to Daniel, who shrugged it off, focused on his newfound freedom to enjoy the porch again in the evenings. I wanted to share his ease. Some instinct kept me watching that curb a little too closely myself. Angela reached out again, this time openly rather than in whispers, saying the state agency's inquiry had rattled more than just Karen. Trent and Marlene were reportedly distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged into an ethics investigation over favors that had, technically, benefited them too through delayed competing contractor bids on their own properties. Karen's usual allies were quietly recalculating their loyalty. I asked Angela if she thought Karen might actually resign under the pressure. She laughed without much humor. "Karen's never given up power in her life," she said. "She'll dig in before she steps back. If anything, the quiet right now probably means she's plotting something, not surrendering." I filed that warning away carefully, the way I'd learned to file everything about Karen. A neighborhood social media group, usually devoted to lost cats and yard sale listings, lit up one evening with a post from someone I didn't recognize, describing being denied a similar accommodation years earlier and quietly giving up. The post referenced our situation without naming us directly, thanking whoever was finally pushing back for giving them the courage to consider filing their own complaint. More stories trickled in after that first post. A mother denied an accessible parking modification. An elderly man whose stairlift request had taken over a year. Each story eerily similar in structure. Delay. Aesthetic objections. Eventual approval only after threats of legal escalation. Karen's pattern wasn't isolated to us. It was a system, quietly running for years, and we'd simply been the first to document it properly. Renata compiled these accounts carefully, treating them as corroborating evidence rather than gossip, reaching out to a few homeowners willing to go on record. Most declined, still wary of retaliation even with Karen seemingly weakened. But two agreed, cautiously, to share their documentation with the state investigators, widening the case from one family's ramp dispute into something resembling a genuine pattern of discriminatory conduct. I started to notice something odd about Karen's behavior during this quiet stretch. She stopped attending the community garden meetings she'd once dominated, skipped a ribbon cutting for the new playground equipment, small absences that would have meant nothing from anyone else but felt conspicuous from a woman who'd built her identity around being seen running everything in Willowbrook. Priya heard from a friend on the management company's staff that Karen had requested copies of everything filed against her personally with the state agency. An unusual, anxious request for someone who publicly maintained she had nothing to hide. Whatever calm Willowbrook was experiencing, it increasingly felt like the stillness before something, not the resolution of anything at all. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch, ramp gleaming faintly under the streetlight, and he asked if I thought it was really over. I told him the truth. I didn't know, but I'd learned enough about Karen Ashcroft in 9 months to believe that whatever came next wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't be fair, and we needed to stay ready for both. The quiet broke exactly 2 weeks later with a new citation. This one bizarre even by Karen's standards. A violation for unauthorized structural addition altering the property's approved footprint, referring to the very ramp the HOA itself had approved in writing. I read the letter twice, certain it was a clerical error, before Renata confirmed grimly that it wasn't. Karen was retracting her own approval. I called the HOA office demanding an explanation and was told, with obvious discomfort, that the board had identified a discrepancy in the original approval and needed to reassess compliance. I asked who on the board had identified this discrepancy. The assistant's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Karen was manufacturing a reversal. Evidence trail be damned. Renata was furious in a way I hadn't seen from her before, calling it retaliatory rescission, a term she said carried serious legal weight, especially given the state investigation already underway. She's not just being petty now, Renata said. She's potentially obstructing a federal accommodation once already granted. This is the kind of move that turns a strong case into a slam dunk. Karen, perhaps sensing the ground shifting beneath the ramp dispute, pivoted her public messaging entirely, sending a mass email to the entire community about protecting Willowbrook's architectural integrity and ensuring fairness for all homeowners, never mentioning Daniel or disability by name, but leaving little doubt among those paying attention exactly whose ramp she meant. The email worked on some neighbors. Unfortunately, a few longtime residents, loyal to Karen for years over unrelated favors, began murmuring about special treatment and rules being rules, conveniently forgetting the falsified minutes and rigged contractor bids that had defined the actual history of our request. Karen understood something ugly and effective. Controlling the narrative mattered more to some people than the truth. Priya, incensed, posted a detailed timeline in the community group herself, laying out every delay, every inconsistency, every contractor conflict of interest in plain, undeniable language, daring anyone to explain how a disabled veteran's ramp constituted an aesthetic threat to the neighborhood. Karen deleted the post within an hour using her admin privileges, but not before dozens had already seen and screenshotted it. The screenshots spread faster than Karen could delete anything, forwarded between neighbors who'd never spoken up before, some horrified they hadn't known the full extent of it. Others simply relieved someone had finally said it plainly. For the first time since we'd moved to Willowbrook, I felt something shift in the neighborhood itself, not universal support, but undeniable, growing scrutiny aimed squarely at Karen. Karen called an emergency board meeting again, this time public, likely sensing that another closed-door session would only fuel more suspicion. She opened by insisting the ramp rescission was purely procedural and unrelated to any personal feelings about our family. A claim that landed badly given the screenshots half the room had already seen circulating for 2 days beforehand. I stood at the microphone again, calmer than I expected to be, and asked directly whether the board could explain what specific discrepancy justified rescinding an ADA-compliant, previously approved modification. Karen said the matter was under legal review and couldn't be discussed publicly. Renata, sitting beside me for the first time, stood and stated plainly that the state agency had already been notified of the rescission. The room went very still at that. Trent shifted visibly in his seat. Marlene suddenly found something urgent to examine on her phone. Karen's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of something like panic before she recovered it, insisting the board welcomed any oversight while clearly not meaning a word of it. I'd never seen her rattled in public before. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. After the meeting, Frank caught up with me again outside, grinning in a way that suggested he'd enjoyed watching Karen squirm as much as I had. "She's never had that happen before," he said. "Nobody's ever brought a lawyer into the room and said the state's name out loud like that." I told him it felt less like victory and more like the fight had just entered a new phase. Renata confirmed as much the next morning, saying the retaliatory rescission gave the state investigators exactly the kind of aggravating factor that could escalate the case from a civil accommodation dispute into something with real financial penalties for the HOA and potentially personal liability for Karen individually, depending on how deliberately the board could be shown to have acted against Daniel specifically. Karen's response to the escalating scrutiny wasn't retreat, as Angela had predicted, but a new tactic entirely. An anonymous-seeming flyer appeared on doorsteps around Willowbrook questioning whether certain homeowners were exploiting disability accommodations to bypass legitimate community standards. Careful never to name us but unmistakable in its target. Given the ongoing gossip already swirling through the neighborhood's group chats, I recognized the printer font immediately, matching an HOA newsletter template Karen used for every official communication. An amateur mistake that told me she'd grown careless in her anger. Priya photographed several copies before Karen's supporters could quietly collect them from mailboxes, adding one more piece to the growing pile of evidence documenting exactly how far Karen was willing to go. Renata suggested this flyer, distributed anonymously but traceable to HOA resources, might constitute a form of harassment or retaliation against us for exercising federally protected rights, a claim she planned to add formally to our ongoing complaint. "She keeps handing us ammunition," Renata said, almost bewildered by Karen's persistence in making mistakes that only strengthened our case further each time. Daniel, for his part, grew quieter during this stretch, not from defeat but from a kind of grim focus I recognized from his recovery after the accident, the same expression he'd worn learning to transfer from bed to chair alone, refusing help, refusing to be broken by something difficult. "She wants us to feel small," he said one night. "I'm done feeling small in my own house." That determination showed itself when Daniel asked to attend the next meeting himself, something he'd avoided since the humiliating hardship hearing months earlier. I worried it would exhaust him, but he insisted, saying he needed Karen and the board to look at him directly, not as a file number, but as the person whose life they'd spent 9 months quietly trying to inconvenience out of principle. At that meeting, Daniel spoke for the first time in his own voice, describing not the legal technicalities but the simple daily reality of what the ramp meant. Being able to leave his own house without help, without fear of tipping sideways, without needing someone else's arms to catch him. The room was silent in a different way this time. Several faces visibly uncomfortable. Karen, to her credit or perhaps her miscalculation, tried to interrupt him twice, citing time limits on public comment that hadn't applied to anyone else that evening. A murmur rippled through the crowd at the obvious double standard, and for the first time, another board member, not Angela, but Marlene, quietly told Karen to let the man finish. A small crack in Karen's usual unified front. Daniel finished by asking the board directly why an approved medical accommodation had been rescinded without any homeowner input or clear explanation. Karen repeated her line about ongoing legal review. Daniel simply said, "That's not an answer," and wheeled himself back from the microphone, leaving the silence to speak for itself in a room that had, for once, actually been listening. Word of that meeting spread through Willowbrook differently than the earlier gossip had. Less speculation now, more quiet solidarity. Two neighbors I'd never spoken with before knocked on our door that week. One bringing a casserole, both saying some version of, "We should have said something sooner." I appreciated it, even while wishing that support had arrived 9 months earlier when we needed it most. Karen, apparently unnerved by the shifting mood, doubled down rather than softened, filing a formal HOA lawsuit against us for violation of community architectural standards, seeking removal of the ramp and reimbursement of alleged administrative costs. Renata laughed out loud reading the filing, calling it one of the weakest, most retaliatory-looking lawsuits she'd seen in years of housing law practice. "This actually helps us," Renata explained, seeing my alarm at being formally sued. A lawsuit initiated after an FHA complaint, specifically targeting the accommodation at its center, is about as clean an example of retaliation as you can hand a state investigator. I hadn't considered that Karen's aggression might be sabotaging her own case more effectively than anything we could have engineered ourselves. We hired our own attorney formally now. Beyond Renata's initial advisory role, a litigator named Cyrus who specialized in HOA disputes and seemed almost gleeful reviewing Karen's lawsuit. She's suing over a modification the state already has on record as a documented FHA violation, he said. This isn't a fight anymore. This is her handing us the rope to finish this properly. Cyrus filed our countersuit within 2 weeks, formally alleging discrimination, retaliation, and breach of fiduciary duty against Karen personally, alongside the HOA board collectively, citing the falsified minutes, the contractor favoritism, the fabricated fees, and now the retaliatory lawsuit itself as a pattern of conduct spanning nearly a year of deliberate obstruction against a disabled homeowner. Karen's own attorney, according to Cyrus's contacts in the local legal community, reportedly urged her to settle quietly before the countersuit gained momentum. Karen refused, apparently convinced her standing in the community and 11 years of unchallenged authority would insulate her from real consequences. Cyrus called this refusal the most predictable mistake a cornered narcissist can make, and I believed him completely. Priya heard through the management company grapevine that Karen had started making calls to other HOA presidents in nearby developments, seemingly building some kind of informal support network, framing herself as a victim of activist homeowners, weaponizing disability law against reasonable community governance. It was a narrative clearly designed to rally sympathy, and disturbingly, It seemed to be working in some circles outside Willowbrook. That narrative reached a local news blog covering suburban HOA disputes, which ran a brief, oddly sympathetic piece framing Karen as a dedicated volunteer facing aggressive legal threats from a homeowner. I felt a fresh wave of fury reading it, watching months of documented obstruction reduced to a one-sided quote from Karen about protecting community standards nobody had bothered to fact-check. Renata encouraged patience rather than panic, reminding me that public narrative wasn't the same as legal reality, and that the state investigation, the falsified records, and Karen's own recorded admission about steering contracts to her brother-in-law would matter far more in front of a judge than in front of a blog's comment section. Still, watching her get sympathy stung more than I expected. Angela reached out again, this time with something more concrete than a whisper. She kept her own copies of board communications for years, she admitted, just in case, and was now willing to hand them over formally to Cyrus, including messages where Karen explicitly instructed her to sit on our file until she figured out the Turner situation months before any hardship hearing occurred. That phrase, the Turner situation, in Karen's own written words, dated weeks before our first denial letter, was exactly the kind of premeditation Cyrus said could transform our case from a strong civil complaint into something approaching textbook intentional discrimination. Angela handed over the printed emails at her kitchen table, hands trembling slightly, admitting she should have done this months earlier. I asked Angela why she'd stayed quiet for so long, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She said Karen had, years earlier, threatened to expose a private family matter of Angela's to the entire community over an unrelated dispute, a threat Karen never followed through on but never let Angela forget either. Fear, turned out, was Karen's primary governing tool, more than any actual bylaw. That detail unsettled me more than almost anything else we'd learned. Not just that Karen abused power over property and permits, but that she'd built an entire quiet reign of personal intimidation over people who should have simply been her neighbors. Angela's courage in finally speaking up, after years of silence, felt like its own small, important twist in a story I'd assumed was only about us. Cyrus incorporated Angela's evidence immediately, filing an amended complaint that painted a far broader picture than a single ramp dispute, years of documented favoritism, falsified records, and now evidence of premeditated targeting against a disabled homeowner specifically. Karen's attorney reportedly requested an emergency settlement conference within days of the amendment landing, a sharp reversal from her earlier refusal to negotiate at all. Karen, however, apparently overruled her own attorney's advice again, according to courthouse gossip Cyrus picked up from a colleague, insisting she would not be bullied into admitting wrongdoing she hadn't committed. Cyrus shook his head hearing this. Some people would rather burn the whole thing down, he said, than admit, even privately, that they were wrong about something small. That refusal to settle set the stage for something Cyrus called discovery, a process where both sides would be legally compelled to hand over relevant documents and communications. He warned me this could take months and would likely surface things about Karen we hadn't even suspected yet. People like her, he said, usually have more skeletons than the one case in front of you. During this discovery period, an unexpected name surfaced in HOA financial records Cyrus subpoenaed, a consulting fee paid quarterly to K. Ashcroft Advisory Services, an entity registered, turned out, to Karen herself, for vaguely described community relations consulting separate from her unpaid HOA presidency. Cyrus called it immediately. Karen had been quietly paying herself HOA funds for years. I sat with that discovery for a long time, turning it over. 11 years of unchallenged authority. And apparently Karen hadn't just been hoarding power for its own sake, or protecting her brother-in-law's construction business. She'd been extracting money directly from the community she claimed to be so devoted to protecting, hidden behind a shell company with her own initials barely disguised. Renata flagged this discovery as potentially the most serious issue yet, suggesting it could constitute embezzlement or fraud depending on how the HOA's bylaws defined compensated versus volunteer board positions. This isn't civil litigation territory anymore for that piece, she said carefully. If this holds up, this is something a district attorney might actually be interested in hearing about. Priya, when I told her, went quiet for a long moment before saying, "That explains the dues increase 2 years ago." She told everyone it was for landscaping enhancements. I remembered that increase too. Remembered grumbling about it along with everyone else. Never once suspecting the extra money might have been quietly routed into Karen's own pocket the entire time. Cyrus requested an emergency forensic accounting of HOA finances as part of discovery, something the board couldn't legally refuse without appearing to obstruct the process further. Trent and Marlene, according to Angela, were reportedly furious upon learning about the consulting fees, having apparently had no idea Karen was personally profiting while they'd simply been following her lead on votes for years. The forensic accountant's preliminary findings, shared with all parties per discovery rules, showed nearly $60,000 paid to Karen's consulting entity over 4 years, alongside evidence that competing contractor bids had been systematically discarded in favor of her brother-in-law's inflated invoices. Cyrus called it a genuinely stunning paper trail for someone who'd spent over a decade lecturing homeowners about transparency and community standards. Karen's public composure, which had survived the initial FHA complaint, the retaliatory lawsuit backfiring, and even Angela's defection, finally seemed to fracture once the financial findings became part of the shared discovery record. Priya reported she'd stopped attending the mailbox kiosk entirely, and her once ubiquitous clipboard hadn't been seen at a single community event in nearly 3 weeks. Trent, to everyone's surprise, resigned from the board abruptly, citing personal reasons in a curt email, though Angela suspected he was distancing himself before the financial scandal fully surfaced publicly. Unwilling to be associated with Karen any longer now that association carried real legal risk rather than simple social convenience within the neighborhood's small hierarchy of favors and loyalty. Marlene followed within the week, her resignation letter notably less discreet, explicitly stating she'd been unaware of certain financial arrangements and felt she could no longer serve alongside leadership operating without transparency. It read like someone building a legal defense in real time, and Cyrus suspected exactly that, guessing Marlene's own attorney had likely drafted every careful, distancing phrase. With Trent and Marlene gone, the HOA board technically lacked quorum to conduct official business, throwing Willowbrook's entire governance into an unusual limbo. Karen, remarkably, refused to acknowledge this technicality, continuing to send official-sounding emails and citations as though nothing had changed, a display of stubbornness that struck even neutral neighbors as increasingly detached from reality. I received one such citation myself during this limbo period, another supposed violation regarding the ramp, This one citing ongoing litigation as grounds to demand its removal despite no court having ordered anything of the kind. Cyrus filed an emergency motion calling it exactly what it was: continued harassment from someone whose authority to issue citations was now legally questionable at best. The judge overseeing our countersuit, reviewing the motion, issued a sharp preliminary injunction barring Karen and the HOA from issuing any further citations, fees, or communications regarding the ramp until the case concluded, explicitly noting in her written order that the pattern of conduct described raises serious concerns regarding good faith and potential retaliatory intent on the HOA's part. That injunction felt like the first real, official acknowledgement from outside our own small circle that everything we'd endured hadn't been imagined or exaggerated. Daniel read the judge's language twice aloud at our kitchen table, lingering on retaliatory intent, like it was a phrase he'd needed a stranger with actual authority to say for almost a year now. Karen, defiant even under a formal injunction, reportedly told a remaining loyal neighbor that the judge didn't understand community governance and that she intended to appeal, a statement that struck Cyrus as almost impressive in its refusal to read the room. "She genuinely believes she's untouchable," he said. "People like that usually need to lose everything before they believe otherwise." The State Fair Housing Agency's investigation, running parallel to our civil case, issued a preliminary finding around this same time, concluding there was reasonable cause to believe discriminatory housing practices occurred, a formal determination that opened the door to federal penalties against the HOA and, depending on further findings, personal liability for Karen individually as the primary decision-maker. Angela texted me the moment the state's finding became public record, a screenshot of local officials being quoted on it, adding only, "I never thought I'd see this happen after 11 years. I sat with that message for a long time, feeling less like celebrating and more like exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since that very first denial letter." Karen's response to the preliminary finding wasn't retreat but escalation into something far more reckless than fabricated fees or falsified minutes. Late one night, our home security camera caught her walking slowly along the property line near the ramp, flashlight in hand, lingering far longer than any casual dog walk route would explain, before disappearing back toward her own house. I reviewed the footage with Daniel the next morning, both of us unsettled by how deliberately she'd moved, pausing directly at the ramp support posts before continuing on. Cyrus advised saving the footage immediately as potential evidence, noting that whatever Karen was doing after dark near a property already under legal protection was, at minimum, deeply concerning behavior for anyone, let alone an HOA president. 3 nights later, Daniel woke me at 2 in the morning, certain he'd heard something outside. We found nothing visibly wrong in the dark, but the next afternoon, testing the ramp before his morning therapy session, Daniel noticed one of the support brackets had come loose, screws visibly backed out rather than sheared. Exactly the kind of tampering that wouldn't happen from ordinary wear. Our contractor, called back to inspect, confirmed the bracket hadn't failed structurally. Someone had loosened it manually, likely with basic hand tools, in a spot positioned to fail under weight during a turn Daniel made routinely each morning. I felt something go cold and furious in me simultaneously, imagining what could have happened if he'd wheeled over it at speed. Unaware, Cyrus filed an emergency police report alongside the ongoing civil case, and detectives reviewed our security footage from the earlier night, Matching Karen's time-stamped presence near the ramp with the approximate time frame the contractor estimated the tampering occurred. It wasn't definitive proof yet, but combined with everything else, it painted a picture of escalation no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. Priya, hearing about the tampering, went pale in a way I hadn't seen from her before, more frightened than angry. "She's never done anything actually dangerous before," she said. "Petty, cruel, unfair, sure. But this could have really hurt him." I agreed, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt genuinely afraid of what Karen might be capable of next. Detectives brought Karen in for questioning based on the footage and the tampering report, though she reportedly denied any wrongdoing, claiming she'd simply been checking on a suspected drainage issue near our property line at 2 in the morning with a flashlight, an explanation Cyrus called almost impressively unconvincing once he heard it secondhand from his contact in the department. No arrest followed immediately, evidence still circumstantial without a confession or direct forensic link. But the detective handling our case privately told Cyrus that Karen's explanation didn't hold up and that they'd be monitoring the situation closely. Cyrus used the police report itself, regardless of charges, as powerful supporting documentation in our ongoing civil case regarding retaliatory harassment and endangerment. Angela called soon after, voice tight with something between fear and vindication. "She's losing control of the narrative and she knows it," Angela said. "I've known her 15 years. She gets more dangerous the more cornered she feels, not less." I asked if she thought Karen would actually escalate further. Angela's silence answered more clearly than words could have managed. We installed our own cameras directly on the ramp itself after that. Motion activated, cloud-backed, refusing to rely on a single angle from the house again. Daniel, remarkably, refused to be intimidated into avoiding the ramp, using it every morning with a kind of defiant determination that I found both terrifying and, quietly, deeply admirable given everything we now knew Karen was willing to attempt. The state agency, informed of the tampering incident and police report, expanded its investigation formally to include potential retaliatory harassment. Under the FHA's anti-interference provisions, a legal category Renata explained carried its own separate penalties beyond simple accommodation denial. "This isn't just about the ramp being denied anymore," she said. "This is now potentially about actual physical endangerment as retaliation." Karen's local news sympathy, meanwhile, evaporated entirely once a different, more thorough reporter picked up the tampering story. This one actually verifying details with police records rather than repeating Karen's talking points uncritically. The headline framed it starkly: HOA president under investigation for alleged harassment of disabled homeowner following ramp dispute. Public opinion, which had briefly wavered, shifted hard against her overnight. Neighbors who'd murmured about special treatment months earlier suddenly went quiet, some reportedly embarrassed at having repeated Karen's framing without question. Priya said the community group chat, once dominated by Karen's allies, had gone almost entirely silent on the subject. Nobody willing to publicly defend someone now formally connected to both financial impropriety and potential criminal tampering with medical equipment. Karen, isolated now from Trent and Marlene, publicly humiliated by the news coverage, and formally under 2 separate investigations, made what Cyrus called her most reckless move yet, showing up unannounced at our front door one evening, insisting on speaking with me alone. Voice tight with something between desperation and barely restrained anger I hadn't seen from her before. I didn't let her inside, keeping the storm door closed between us. Daniel positioned just behind me in the hallway. Karen launched immediately into a rambling monologue about how we'd destroyed her reputation and ruined 11 years of service over one ramp, conveniently omitting the falsified records, the contractor kickbacks, and the tampering that had brought us to this exact moment. "You did this to yourself," I told her, keeping my voice level despite everything screaming inside me to react differently. "Nobody made you falsify board votes. Nobody made you loosen those screws." Something in her expression cracked at that. Real and unguarded for perhaps the first time since I'd known her, before she caught herself and rearranged her face back into practiced composure. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, quieter now, almost pleading. "Everyone in this neighborhood watching everything you do, waiting for you to fail." I didn't fully understand yet what she meant, assuming it was simply the paranoia of someone caught, someone grasping for sympathy after being exposed. I didn't yet know how close to something real that strange comment actually was. She left without another word, walking stiffly back toward her own house, and I stood on the porch for a long time afterward, unsettled by the visit in a way I couldn't fully articulate to Daniel that night. Something about her tone, that flash of something almost human beneath the anger, sat wrong with me, though I couldn't yet name exactly why. 2 days later, Angela called with something that finally explained it. "I found out what she meant," Angela said carefully. "About everyone watching, waiting for her to fail." She paused, then added, "Karen's father lives with her. He's been in a wheelchair for 6 years. Nobody in this neighborhood has ever known, because she's kept him completely hidden the entire time." I sat down hard on the kitchen chair, hearing that, the pieces of 9 months suddenly rearranging into something far uglier and stranger than simple greed or favoritism. Karen Ashcroft, who'd spent nearly a year blocking my husband's wheelchair ramp on aesthetic grounds, had been quietly caring for her own disabled father inside a house specifically designed to hide his existence from public view. Angela explained further, voice heavy with old, uncomfortable knowledge she'd apparently carried for years without fully understanding its weight. Karen's father, a proud former Marine, had suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed, and Karen, terrified of the community perceiving her family as anything less than the flawless image she'd cultivated, had built his accommodations entirely inside, invisible from any street or neighbor's view. She never fought for accessible parking, never fought for a ramp for her own house, Angela said, because admitting he needed one meant admitting weakness existed in her family. It was never really about property values with the Turners. I think, somewhere twisted up in her head, your husband's ramp existing publicly was a kind of mirror she couldn't stand looking into. I didn't know what to do with this information immediately. It didn't excuse anything Karen had done. The falsified minutes, the tampering, the months of cruelty, but it recontextualized all of it into something sadder and more human than I'd allowed myself to imagine. I told Daniel that night, watching him absorb it with more grace than I managed. Quiet and thoughtful rather than vindicated. "That's not an excuse," he said finally, echoing exactly what I'd been thinking. "But it explains a lot." I agreed. still turning over the strange tragedy of a woman so consumed by appearances that she'd hidden her own father rather than advocate for accessibility. Choosing instead to punish a stranger's family for demanding, publicly, the very accommodation she'd never allowed her own household. Renata, when I told her, remained pragmatically focused despite the emotional weight of the revelation. It's relevant context for a jury eventually, possibly even useful for understanding motive, she said, but it doesn't change the legal exposure. If anything, it demonstrates she knew exactly what these accommodations meant and deliberately withheld that empathy from you and Daniel specifically. I found myself, unexpectedly, feeling something close to pity alongside my anger, a complicated, uncomfortable mixture I hadn't anticipated. Priya, when I mentioned it carefully, had less patience for nuance. Pity is fine, she said, but it doesn't undo the tampering, or the falsified votes, or 9 months of you two suffering while she protected her own family in secret. The state investigators, informed of this new detail through a witness statement Angela eventually gave formally, apparently found it significant for an entirely different reason than sympathy. It demonstrated Karen possessed direct, personal, intimate knowledge of accessibility needs and legal accommodation requirements, undercutting any possible defense that her actions stemmed from ignorance rather than deliberate, informed discrimination against our family specifically. Cyrus called this development devastating for her case, frankly, in the coldest possible legal sense. You can't claim you didn't understand the stakes of denying a ramp, he explained, when you've been quietly managing your own father's identical needs behind closed doors for 6 years. This isn't ignorance anymore. This is someone who understood exactly what she was doing to you both. Karen, perhaps sensing how badly this revelation would land if it became public through the investigation rather than her own framing, made a strange, sudden decision she called a press conference on her own front lawn, flanked by nobody, no allies remaining, and announced she would be stepping down as HOA president, effective immediately, for personal family reasons. Standing at the edge of the small gathered crowd of neighbors and one local reporter, I watched Karen deliver a statement carefully scrubbed of any specifics, mentioning nothing about her father, the falsified records, or the tampering investigation, framing her resignation instead as a dignified, voluntary step back after years of dedicated service to a community she claimed to love deeply. A reporter asked directly about the ongoing state fair housing investigation. Karen's composure, so carefully maintained through the entire prepared statement, faltered visibly at the question, her answer devolving into vague references to pending legal matters I can't discuss, before she abruptly ended the press conference and walked back inside without taking further questions from anyone gathered on her lawn. The resignation, rather than closing the story, seemed only to intensify scrutiny. Investigative journalists, smelling a more substantial story than a simple HOA dispute, began digging deeper into Karen's finances, her consulting entity, and the tampering investigation, publishing a follow-up piece within days that finally, explicitly connected every thread: the ramp denial, the falsified votes, the kickbacks, the alleged tampering. That article, unlike the earlier sympathetic blog post, spread widely, shared across regional news outlets and disability advocacy accounts, turning our private 9-month ordeal into something resembling a cautionary Tale about HOA overreach and disability discrimination discussed by strangers who'd never met either of us but recognized immediately the pattern of abuse we documented so carefully throughout the entire fight. Karen, no longer HOA president, no longer shielded by the authority of her position, apparently retreated almost entirely from public view, according to Priya's updated neighborhood intelligence. No more clipboard, no more mailbox commentary. Her once immaculate front yard reportedly showing the first signs of neglect anyone in Willowbrook had witnessed in over a decade of her relentless upkeep. The interim board, hastily assembled from remaining homeowners including, notably, Angela as acting president, immediately withdrew the retaliatory lawsuit against us and issued a formal written apology, acknowledging significant procedural failures in how our original accommodation request had been handled, careful legal language that nonetheless felt, finally, like an actual, if incomplete, admission of everything we'd endured. Cyrus called the withdrawal essentially a surrender, advising us that continuing our own countersuit now carried significant leverage given the HOA's public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Renata agreed, suggesting we push for both meaningful financial damages and, more importantly to me, formal, binding policy changes ensuring no future homeowner in Willowbrook would endure anything resembling our 9-month ordeal. Negotiations began within weeks. The new interim board, notably more cooperative than Karen had ever been, eager to resolve everything before the state's formal findings became fully public and potentially exposed the HOA to even greater liability. I sat through those negotiations feeling something unfamiliar after nearly a year of fighting. Not triumph exactly, but something calmer, closer to being finally, properly heard. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation into the ramp tampering advanced separately, detectives eventually recovering a partial fingerprint from one of the loosened brackets that, combined with the time-stamped security footage, and Karen's own contradictory explanation, was enough for prosecutors to formally file charges against her for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment, elevating the entire situation well beyond civil dispute territory. Karen's arrest, when it happened, was quiet compared to everything preceding it. No dramatic confrontation, simply detectives arriving at her home one weekday morning, Priya texting me a photo from across the street of Karen being escorted, composed but visibly diminished, into an unmarked car. I felt almost nothing watching that photo arrive, exhausted past the point of triumph after so many months. Daniel, watching the news brief that evening covering Karen's arrest, said something that stuck with me longer than any legal victory could have. "I keep thinking about her father," he said quietly. "Whatever happens to her, I hope somebody's actually taking care of him now. Honestly, not just hiding him. It was, somehow, exactly the right thing to feel, and I loved him for feeling it." Angela, now formally serving as interim HOA president, reached out personally about Karen's father, having quietly arranged, through a social worker contact, an in-home care assessment for him separate from any legal proceedings against Karen herself. It felt like the one genuinely uncomplicated act of decency in this entire saga, untangled from lawsuits, investigations, or the messy human wreckage surrounding it. The civil case reached a settlement shortly after Karen's arrest became public, the HOA's insurance ultimately covering a substantial financial payment to us for the 9 months of documented discrimination, retaliation, and endangerment alongside formal, binding changes to Willowbrook's bylaws explicitly codifying expedited, mandatory approval processes for medically necessary accommodation requests going forward, with real accountability built into the language. Cyrus called the settlement terms about as complete a resolution as these cases ever get, acknowledging that money couldn't undo 9 months of stress, fear, and physical risk, but that the bylaw changes might genuinely protect future disabled homeowners in Willowbrook from experiencing anything resembling what we'd endured under Karen's increasingly desperate, escalating campaign against our family. I should have felt lighter after the settlement, and in some ways I did, but a strange restlessness lingered, a sense that something about the whole saga remained unfinished, unresolved in some way the legal paperwork couldn't quite capture. Daniel noticed it too, watching me stare too long at old files I no longer needed, unable to fully close that particular chapter yet. Priya, sensing my unease, suggested it was simply exhaustion catching up after nearly a year of sustained fighting. The strange emptiness that follows finally winning something you'd stopped believing you'd ever actually get. I wanted to believe that was all it was, though something about Karen's continued silence, her total disappearance from any public accountability beyond the arrest, unsettled me still. The criminal case against Karen moved slowly through the court system, her attorney reportedly pursuing every possible delay and procedural motion available, a strategy Cyrus called buying time, rather than building a defense, given how thoroughly the evidence, footage, fingerprint, contradictory statements, had already stacked against her long before any trial date was even set. During this waiting period, I received an unexpected letter, handwritten, no return address, though the shaky, careful cursive suggested an older writer. It was from Karen's father, identifying himself simply as Walter, apologizing for what his daughter had done to us, explaining he'd only recently learned the full extent of it from a social worker rather than from Karen herself. Walter's letter described years of quiet isolation inside his own home, Karen insisting visitors weren't necessary, that community events were too much trouble to navigate with his wheelchair, effectively cutting him off from the very neighborhood she policed so ruthlessly for everyone else. Reading it, I finally understood the full, sad shape of what Angela had only partially explained months earlier. I wrote back to Walter, unsure exactly what to say to a stranger caught so unwillingly in his daughter's downfall, settling eventually on simple honesty, that I was sorry for what he'd endured too, that Daniel and I held no anger toward him, and that I hoped, whatever came next for Karen, that he'd finally get the independence and community connection he deserved. Walter responded again weeks later, mentioning almost shyly that Angela's social worker contact had arranged a proper accessible van service for him, his first real outing in years being a simple trip to a diner nearby, something he described with more genuine joy than I'd expected from a letter otherwise steeped in apology and quiet grief over his daughter's choices. This small, unexpected correspondence became, strangely, the thing that finally let me set down some of the anger I'd been carrying. Karen's cruelty hadn't been abstract or simply strategic. It had cost her own father years of isolation too, a victim in his own right of the same rigid, appearance-obsessed control that had made our 9 months so miserable and dangerous. Meanwhile, the State Fair Housing Agency finalized its formal ruling, concluding definitively that Willowbrook's HOA, under Karen's direct leadership, had engaged in disability discrimination and retaliatory harassment against Daniel and me, imposing significant civil penalties against the HOA itself and referring the falsified board minutes and financial improprieties to state licensing authorities for further separate review. Cyrus called this final ruling the cleanest possible vindication, a document that would exist permanently on record. Useful, he noted, for any future disabled homeowner anywhere researching how HOAs could and couldn't legally handle accommodation requests. Something about that permanence, that our fight might genuinely help strangers we'd never meet, felt like the first truly satisfying outcome of this entire ordeal. Karen's criminal trial date finally arrived nearly 5 months after her arrest, delayed repeatedly by defense motions that ultimately changed nothing substantial about the evidence against her. Daniel and I attended together, not required to testify that particular day, but wanting, after everything, to witness this specific piece of accountability in person rather than secondhand through Priya's updates. Karen looked smaller in the courtroom than she ever had at any HOA meeting, stripped of her clipboard, her blazers, her practiced authority, sitting beside her attorney in something closer to ordinary business clothes. I felt an unexpected flicker of something almost like pity watching her, quickly overtaken by the memory of that loosened bracket, of Daniel's will catching, of everything she'd risked. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, the security footage, the tampering timeline, the fingerprint evidence, Karen's own contradictory statements to detectives about a non-existent drainage inspection at 2 in the morning. Her defense attorney argued reasonable doubt, suggesting the tampering could have been unrelated vandalism, a theory that grew visibly weaker with each piece of corroborating evidence presented. Cyrus, watching from the gallery beside us, leaned over at one point and whispered that the fingerprint evidence alone made acquittal unlikely, regardless of how the defense tried to spin the surrounding circumstances. I appreciated his confidence, though nothing about this entire year had left me feeling secure trusting outcomes before they were finalized and undeniable in front of me. Angela testified as a witness for the prosecution, describing Karen's documented pattern of premeditated targeting, the falsified board minutes, the Turner situation emails, painting a picture not of a single reckless night but of nearly a year of deliberate, escalating cruelty that culminated, almost inevitably given everything preceding it, in an act that could have seriously injured my husband. I testified too, describing not the legal technicalities Cyrus and Renata had spent months untangling, but the simple daily terror of wondering, every single morning, whether that ramp would hold Daniel safely, whether today would be the day something failed beneath him because a woman with a grudge had decided our family's dignity mattered less than her own control over the neighborhood. Daniel's testimony was the one I dreaded most, watching him describe, in his own steady voice, what it felt like discovering the loosened bracket, understanding immediately that someone had deliberately tried to hurt him specifically. He spoke without visible anger, simply factual and clear, which somehow landed harder in that quiet courtroom than any dramatic outburst could have managed. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours, a wait that stretched unbearably despite Cyrus's continued reassurance about the strength of the evidence. Daniel and I sat in the courthouse hallway barely speaking, both of us exhausted past words, until the bailiff finally called us back in for the verdict neither of us had quite let ourselves believe would actually arrive. Guilty. On both counts, criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. I felt Daniel's hand find mine before I even fully processed the words, gripping tight, and something in my chest finally, fully unclenched after nearly a year and a half of carrying this fight like a weight I'd forgotten I was capable of setting down completely. Karen showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read, staring straight ahead. Whatever composure remained apparently the last defense she had left. Her attorney requested sentencing be deferred pending a report. Standard procedure, Cyrus explained quietly, though it meant the true consequences of everything wouldn't be finalized for several more weeks. A small, frustrating delay after everything we'd already endured. Outside the courthouse, reporters who'd followed the case since the earlier news coverage waited for comment. I kept my statement brief, saying only that we hoped this outcome would help other disabled homeowners feel empowered to fight similar discrimination, refusing to give Karen's downfall any more spectacle than the facts themselves had already thoroughly and deservedly provided. Priya met us at home with a bottle of sparkling cider, insisting we mark the moment properly even without full sentencing yet finalized. Frank stopped by too, along with two other neighbors who'd become genuine friends over the ordeal rather than merely sympathetic bystanders. Felt, for the first time in a long while, like Willowbrook might actually become the community it had always advertised itself as. Word came weeks later that sentencing had been set, and Cyrus warned us not to expect anything dramatic. Karen had no prior criminal record, and first-time offenders in cases like this often received probation rather than significant jail time, regardless of the severity of intent involved. I told him honestly that a criminal conviction on record already felt like more than I'd once believed possible. The sentencing hearing itself was brief. The judge, addressing Karen directly, noted the troubling abuse of community authority underlying the case, sentencing her to 18 months probation, mandatory community service, and a formal restraining order preventing any contact with Daniel or me, alongside the existing civil penalties and financial restitution already established through the earlier settlement. Karen's community service, somewhat ironically given everything, was designated specifically toward disability advocacy organizations, a condition Cyrus suspected the judge had chosen deliberately, forcing Karen to spend the coming months directly confronting the very population she'd spent nearly a year discriminating against, rather than simply serving out an anonymous, disconnected sentence somewhere else entirely. I didn't know how to feel about that particular detail, a kind of poetic justice, perhaps, though I doubted genuine remorse would follow simply from mandated hours logged at some organization's front desk. Renata cautioned me that legal consequences rarely produced actual internal change in people like Karen, and that our satisfaction needed to come from accountability itself, not from any fantasy of her transformation. Willowbrook, meanwhile, continued adjusting to life after Karen. Angela's interim presidency became permanent after a genuinely contested election, the first in over a decade, drawing more community participation than anyone remembered seeing before. New bylaws passed easily, formalizing accessible modification processes, term limits for board positions, and mandatory financial transparency reports nobody would have dared propose while Karen still held power. Daniel and I attended that election meeting together, watching neighbors actually debate policy substantively rather than simply defer to whoever held the clipboard. Felt strange, almost surreal, witnessing something as ordinary as functional local governance after everything we'd endured to get there. Priya joked that we'd accidentally started a small, unglamorous revolution just by asking for a wheelchair ramp. Walter, Karen's father, reached out one final time before we mostly lost touch naturally, thanking us again, mentioning he'd moved into an assisted living community, better suited to his needs. A decision he said he'd finally felt empowered to make himself rather than remain hidden away out of his daughter's misplaced shame. I was genuinely glad for him, wherever this whole saga had left everyone else. Karen herself, according to occasional Priya updates over the following months, kept largely to herself, rarely seen outside her house. Her once manicured lawn now merely ordinary, unremarkable among the others on the street. I found I didn't need updates about her anymore, our lives having finally diverged after nearly 2 years tangled together through circumstances none of us had chosen. The ramp itself, still standing exactly where the whole fight had begun, became something unexpectedly ordinary too. Just a ramp now, used daily without ceremony, without fear, without the weight of everything it had once represented. Daniel wheeled down it each morning for coffee on the porch. And some mornings, that simple, uneventful routine felt like the truest victory of the entire ordeal. Just as life seemed to be settling into something resembling normalcy. An unexpected complication arrived. The state licensing board investigating Karen's financial improprieties uncovered something even Cyrus hadn't anticipated. During our own civil case, a second, older shell entity linked to Karen predating even the K. Ashcroft Advisory Services fees, suggesting the financial misconduct ran deeper and longer than anyone had previously realized. This older entity, investigators found, had been receiving payments not from Willowbrook's HOA directly, but from a regional homeowners association trade group. Karen had served on years before becoming Willowbrook's president, raising troubling questions about whether her pattern of self-dealing had followed her across multiple communities long before Daniel and I ever encountered her at that first welcome meeting. Angela, informed of this expanding investigation as Willowbrook's permanent president, forwarded the information to state authorities immediately, along with a formal statement expressing the community's full cooperation with any broader inquiry. Struck me, hearing this, that our fight over one ramp had inadvertently pulled a much larger, older thread loose, one stretching back years before Willowbrook even existed as Karen's kingdom. Investigators reportedly reached out to homeowners from Karen's previous community, uncovering, through Cyrus's contacts, at least 2 other disabled residents who'd faced remarkably similar accommodation denials years earlier, both of whom had eventually moved away rather than fight, assuming, as we nearly had, that an HOA's authority over such requests was simply unchallengeable, absolute, and not worth the exhausting battle. One of those former residents, a woman named Corinne, reached out to me directly after seeing our case covered in the regional news, describing almost the exact same pattern: aesthetic denials, mysterious hardship hearings, eventual quiet capitulation only after she'd simply given up and sold her house rather than continue fighting a woman who seemed to hold infinite institutional patience for cruelty. Corinne's story, added to the expanding investigation, painted Karen not as an isolated bad actor within one unlucky neighborhood, but as someone who'd refined this exact method of discrimination and financial extraction across multiple communities over more than a decade, moving on each time before consequences could fully catch up, until, finally, she'd encountered a family with the resources and stubbornness to actually fight back properly. Cyrus, Reviewing Corinne's account alongside the state's expanding findings suggested this broader pattern could significantly influence Karen's probation terms or potentially open her to additional charges in another jurisdiction entirely, a possibility neither of us had anticipated when we'd first submitted that simple ramp permit application what felt now like an entire lifetime ago. I found myself, oddly, less angry hearing about this wider pattern than I expected, replaced instead by a grim, weary clarity we hadn't just been unlucky, singled out by one uniquely cruel woman's personal grudge. We'd been one stop, one community, in a much longer, quieter pattern of harm that had simply never been documented thoroughly enough before to actually stick. Renata pointed out something important during this period, our willingness to document everything meticulously, to hire attorneys, to push through nearly a year of exhausting fights, had been precisely what finally exposed a pattern that had likely harmed disabled homeowners for over a decade across multiple communities. People who'd never had the resources or stamina to fight the way we ultimately had. That reframing helped something settle in me that the initial verdict alone hadn't quite managed. This hadn't only been about Daniel's ramp, or our 9 months of stress, or even Karen's individual cruelty. It had become, almost accidentally, something larger, evidence that might finally hold accountable a pattern of institutional discrimination that had quietly persisted, unchecked, for far longer than anyone realized. The additional investigation moved slower than our original case, spanning jurisdictions and years of records, but Cyrus stayed loosely involved as a consulting witness given his familiarity with Karen's methods from our own fight. Corinne, emboldened by finally having language and evidence for what she'd experienced years earlier, began quietly reaching out to other former residents from Karen's previous community too. 3 more families eventually came forward, each with strikingly similar stories, each having assumed, as Corinne and nearly we ourselves had, that fighting an HOA president was an unwinnable battle not worth the cost. Watching this small, unlikely coalition assemble itself out of years of scattered, isolated suffering felt like the truest unraveling of everything Karen had built her reputation and authority upon. Karen's attorney, according to Cyrus's contacts, reportedly attempted to negotiate a broader settlement covering this expanding pool of claims before the state's investigation could formally conclude, hoping to limit both financial exposure and additional criminal referral. Whether that strategy would succeed remained uncertain, but its very existence confirmed how seriously even Karen's own legal team now understood the scope of what had finally caught up with her. Daniel and I, watching this larger story unfold mostly from a distance now, found ourselves less consumed by it than we might have been a year earlier. Our own fight had concluded, our own settlement finalized, our own ramp standing ordinary and functional outside our kitchen window. This next chapter, whatever its outcome, belonged now to Corinne and the others who'd finally found their voices. Still, I couldn't help feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction watching justice widen beyond our own specific grievance. A sense that the exhausting, expensive, emotionally brutal fight we'd waged over something as simple as a wheelchair ramp had, in some genuinely meaningful way, cracked open something much larger and longer standing than either Daniel or I had ever set out to challenge that first frustrating year. Angela mentioned, during one of our now occasional catch-ups as Willowbrook's president, that the expanded investigation had prompted several nearby HOAs to proactively review their own accommodation policies, wary of similar exposure. Whatever else came of Karen's downfall, it seemed increasingly clear that her particular brand of quiet, entrenched abuse had become, unexpectedly, a genuine cautionary tale reaching well beyond our own small development. I thought often, during this waiting period, about that strange visit Karen made to our porch months earlier. Her rambling insistence that we'd destroyed something she'd built over 11 years. I understood now, more fully than I had that evening, that what we'd actually destroyed wasn't a reputation. It was a pattern of impunity she'd apparently relied upon successfully for far longer than Willowbrook alone. Renata, wrapping up her formal involvement in our original case as the broader investigation continued independently, told me something during our final consultation that stuck with me longer than most of the legal language from the entire ordeal. Most cases like this never go anywhere, she said, because most people give up before reaching the part where it actually starts to matter. You didn't give up, she continued. And because of that, people you'll probably never meet are finally getting some accountability too. I thought about Corinne, about the families I'd never spoken with directly, about Walter finally living somewhere he could leave his own front door freely. Somewhere in nearly 2 years of exhausting fighting, something genuinely worthwhile had accumulated alongside all the anger. The additional state findings, once finalized months later, confirmed a pattern spanning 3 separate communities and over a decade, resulting in expanded restitution requirements against Karen and a formal referral for additional charges in the jurisdiction covering her previous HOA presidency. A legal reckoning considerably larger than anything Daniel or I had imagined possible that first frustrating week we'd simply asked for a ramp. Karen's probation officer, according to a detail Angela mentioned, having heard secondhand through the disability advocacy organization overseeing her community service, reported that Karen remained largely uncooperative during her mandated hours, resentful rather than reflective. A small, unsurprising confirmation that legal consequences alone rarely produce the genuine accountability people sometimes hope punishment might automatically deliver. I let that detail go without much reaction, having learned somewhere in this long ordeal that Karen's internal state mattered far less to me now than the concrete, structural changes her downfall had actually produced. Willowbrook's new bylaws, the expanded investigation protecting future disabled homeowners, Walter's independence, Corinne's overdue vindication, all of it existing regardless of whether Karen herself ever genuinely changed. Daniel, for his part, seemed to have made peace with the entire saga more completely than I sometimes managed myself, focusing instead on smaller, steadier victories, finishing physical therapy milestones, returning part-time to his old engineering firm through a remote arrangement, rebuilding a life that finally felt like it belonged to him again rather than something constantly under siege from a neighbor's grudge. We started, cautiously, letting ourselves plan things again that had felt impossible during those exhausting 9 months. A modest vacation, accessible lodging carefully researched in advance. The simple, previously unthinkable luxury of not having to brace ourselves each morning for whatever new obstacle Karen might have manufactured overnight. Felt, slowly, like getting our actual life back. Priya, watching this gradual return to normalcy, joked one evening over dinner that we'd become something like accidental local celebrities for defeating the neighborhood's final boss. A comparison that made Daniel actually laugh, genuinely and easily, in a way I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to admit even to myself throughout this entire ordeal. Willowbrook itself continued evolving under Angela's more transparent, collaborative leadership, hosting its first genuinely well-attended community event in years, an accessibility-focused block party. Of all things, that Daniel and I attended together, watching neighbors we'd barely known during Karen's reign actually mingle, laugh, and engage with a sense of community that had felt entirely absent before. Frank approached us there, grinning, admitting he'd finally filed his own long-delayed request for a modest handicap parking modification near his driveway, something he'd avoided pursuing for years after watching Karen make an example of anyone who asked for anything. "Took me watching you two actually win," he said, "to believe it was even possible to ask again." That comment settled somewhere deep and warm in my chest. A reminder that our exhausting fight had rippled outward in ways neither Daniel nor I had ever intended or expected when we'd simply wanted a safe way for him to leave his own front door. Sometimes, apparently, fighting for your own basic dignity quietly gives other people permission to finally ask for theirs too. I ran into Karen only once more after the sentencing, entirely by accident, both of us reaching for the same parking spot outside the pharmacy downtown. She looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, the sharp authority that once filled every room she entered now entirely absent. We exchanged no words, simply a brief, awkward acknowledgement before each continuing separately about our day. I felt, in that strange, anticlimactic moment, mostly just tired, the specific, sharp anger I'd carried against her for nearly 2 years having quietly, gradually dulled into something more like distant weariness. Whatever Karen Ashcroft's remaining life looked like now, stripped of her clipboard, her authority, her carefully hidden father, her elaborate financial schemes, it existed entirely separate from ours going forward. Renata, hearing about that brief, wordless encounter later, said something I found genuinely comforting. "That's usually how it actually ends," she said. "Not with some dramatic final confrontation, just two people who used to matter enormously to each other's daily existence, eventually becoming almost strangers again." It wasn't cinematic, but it felt, somehow, exactly right and complete. The regional disability advocacy organization overseeing Karen's community service eventually published an anonymized case study referencing our situation among several others, used now in training materials for HOA board members nationwide regarding legal accommodation obligations. Cyrus sent me the link, noting with quiet pride that our 9-month nightmare had become, unexpectedly, an educational tool protecting strangers we'd never meet. I read that case study late one night, recognizing our own story reduced to careful, clinical language, dates, denials, documented patterns, legal citations, everything that had once felt like the most consuming, personal battle of our lives now serving as a professional cautionary example for people managing entirely different communities, entirely different families, entirely different disabled homeowners somewhere else. Daniel, reading it over my shoulder, pointed out something I'd initially missed, a small footnote referencing Karen's earlier, nearly identical case, from Karen's previous community, cited specifically to illustrate how documented patterns across multiple properties strengthen discrimination claims. Our fight and Karen's, separated by years and states, existed now permanently linked in professional literature meant to help others recognize the same warning signs. That linkage felt, somehow, like the truest resolution of everything we'd endured, not just personal vindication, not just Karen's downfall, but genuine, structural knowledge now available to help someone else. Somewhere. Recognize early what had taken Daniel and me nearly a year of exhausting fighting to fully understand and document about the specific, insidious pattern of institutional discrimination we'd faced. I called Corinne. Something I hadn't done in months. Mostly just to share the footnote and see how she was doing generally. She laughed. A little wearily, saying she'd found her own strange peace with everything too. Having recently helped a coworker navigate an unrelated, but similarly frustrating accommodation dispute using language and strategies she'd learned entirely through our shared, painful experience with Karen. We should be annoyed we became experts in this, Corinne said. But honestly, I'm kind of glad I can actually help someone now instead of just quietly giving up like I did the first time. I understood exactly what she meant, recognizing the strange, unexpected value that sometimes emerges from surviving something genuinely unjust and refusing to simply let it disappear unaddressed. Angela, meanwhile, continued steadily rebuilding Willowbrook's actual sense of community. Something Karen's 11 years of controlled, fear-based governance had apparently suppressed far more thoroughly than any of us fully recognized while we were still inside it. A genuine neighborhood watch program started. Entirely voluntary, entirely welcomed, standing in quiet, deliberate contrast to Karen's old clipboard-enforced version of community involvement. I found myself, nearly 2 years after that first denied ramp permit, genuinely looking forward to HOA meetings again. Something I never would have believed possible during those exhausting early months of hardship hearings and fabricated fees. Angela ran meetings with actual warmth, actual openness to disagreement, actual accountability, everything Karen's version of leadership had so thoroughly, deliberately lacked. Daniel's ramp, still standing exactly where this entire saga began, remained ordinary now in the best possible way, just infrastructure, just a normal part of our home, no longer symbolic of anything except itself. Some mornings, watching him will down it easily toward the mailbox, I felt a quiet, settled gratitude entirely separate from the anger and exhaustion that had defined most of our time in Willowbrook. We hosted a small gathering that spring. Nothing formal, just neighbors on our porch. Ramp visible and unremarkable beside us. Priya bringing her usual lemonade. Frank proudly mentioning his own newly approved parking modification. Angela stopping by briefly between HOA duties. Felt, finally, like the community Willowbrook's original glossy brochure had promised us before we'd ever met Karen Ashcroft. Somewhere during that gathering, watching Daniel laugh easily with neighbors who'd once been strangers too afraid to speak up on our behalf, I realized the fight itself had permanently changed, reshaping not just our own family's daily life, but the entire fabric of the small community we'd almost given up on entirely during those darkest, most exhausting months of denial and retaliation. The final piece of accountability arrived almost a year after Karen's initial sentencing, when the additional jurisdiction covering her previous HOA presidency completed its own separate prosecution, resulting in a second conviction for financial fraud connected to the older shell entity investigators had uncovered during the broader investigation our own case had inadvertently triggered months earlier. This second conviction carried more substantial consequences than the first. Actual jail time rather than probation, given the scale of documented financial harm across multiple homeowners over several years. Cyrus, informing us of the outcome, noted quietly that this particular sentence had almost nothing directly to do with our own case anymore. existing instead as accountability for years of harm predating us entirely. Corinne called me the day that second sentencing became public, her voice carrying something I recognized immediately, having felt something similar myself after our own verdict months earlier. Not celebration exactly, but a deep, hard-won relief that years of quiet, unaddressed harm had finally, undeniably, been acknowledged by someone with actual authority to do something meaningful about it. I thought, hearing this final piece of news, about how strange and unplanned this entire journey had become, starting with something as simple and reasonable as a wheelchair ramp permit, ending nearly 3 years later having inadvertently exposed a decade-long pattern of discrimination and financial fraud spanning multiple communities and families we'd never have otherwise known existed. Renata, reflecting on the entire arc during one final catch-up call, said something I've returned to often since. Most discrimination like this survives specifically because individual victims assume they're isolated, that fighting back is pointless against someone with institutional power, she said. You proved that assumption wrong, and that's rarer and more valuable than people usually realize. Willowbrook's new bylaws, meanwhile, had already become something of a model referenced by a few neighboring HOAs reviewing their own accommodation policies. According to Angela, who mentioned fielding occasional calls from other community presidents asking how Willowbrook had restructured its approval process so thoroughly after Karen's departure. Something genuinely useful had grown, slowly, from all that earlier documented cruelty. Daniel returned fully to in-person work eventually, his engineering firm accommodating a hybrid schedule that let him manage his energy carefully while still engaging fully with colleagues and projects he genuinely missed during the most consuming months of our fight. Watching him rebuild that piece of his identity, separate entirely from Karen or Willowbrook, felt like its own quiet,
important victory.
I found myself, surprisingly, developing something like a secondary calling through everything we'd endured, informally advising a few other homeowners locally who'd heard our story and reached out, uncertain how to handle their own HOA disputes. Nothing formal or paid, just someone willing to share what documentation and persistence had actually accomplished when we'd once assumed neither would matter. One such homeowner, a young mother named Elena facing a strikingly similar accommodation denial for her son's mobility equipment, called me in tears one evening, convinced her situation was hopeless. I walked her through exactly what Renata and Cyrus had taught us. Document everything, request records formally, never assume aesthetic language actually means what it claims to mean. Elena's situation resolved within 6 weeks, considerably faster than ours had. Her HOA apparently unwilling to risk the kind of prolonged, expensive fight Karen had eventually lost so publicly and thoroughly. Hearing her son finally use his accessible entrance without months of unnecessary struggle felt like watching our own hard-won knowledge translate directly into someone else's immediate relief. I mentioned Elena's quick resolution to Priya, who laughed and said, only half joking, that we'd basically become the neighborhood's unofficial disability rights consultants entirely by accident. I told her I'd rather have never needed to learn any of it in the first place, but that if we had to endure everything Karen put us through, at least something genuinely useful had come from documenting all of it so thoroughly. Nearly 3 years after that first denied permit, Daniel and I hosted a small anniversary dinner, not celebrating Karen's downfall specifically, but simply marking how far we'd traveled since that terrifying first week home from the hospital, watching him stare up at 3 impossible steps from his wheelchair in our own driveway, uncertain whether our life together would ever feel normal again. Did eventually feel normal again, though normal now included things we couldn't have imagined that first devastating week. A functioning, ordinary ramp, a genuinely engaged community, a small informal network of people we'd helped navigate similar fights, and a hard one, thorough understanding of exactly how far institutional cruelty can travel before someone finally, properly documents and challenges it. Angela stopped by that anniversary evening briefly, bringing a small gift, a framed copy of Willowbrook's updated accessibility bylaws, matted simply, a strange but genuinely meaningful memento marking exactly what our exhausting fight had ultimately produced for the community going forward. Daniel hung it near the front door, close enough to see whenever he wheeled past it each morning. Walter sent one final letter that same month, mentioning he'd settled comfortably into his assisted living community, made actual friends for the first time in years, and had recently started, tentatively, speaking to a counselor about his complicated relationship with Karen and the isolation her shame had imposed on both of them for so long. I was glad, genuinely, for whatever peace he'd found. I thought often, during this calmer stretch, about Angela's original whispered warning in that parking lot so long ago. That Karen doesn't forget people who push back and doesn't lose. Karen had, ultimately, lost almost everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom temporarily, her carefully hidden family arrangement. All of it unraveled specifically because we'd refused to simply disappear quietly. Cyrus, wrapping up his own final involvement in anything connected to our case, mentioned once that he'd started referencing our situation, anonymized, in occasional legal seminars, about disability accommodation law, calling it a genuinely instructive example of how documented persistence eventually overwhelms even deeply entrenched institutional abuse. I found a strange, quiet pride in that description, unearned as I sometimes felt. Priya, still our closest friend from the entire ordeal, joked one evening that we should write our own version of Willowbrook's welcome brochure, an honest one this time, explaining exactly what genuine community involvement, transparent governance, and real accessibility actually looked like, rather than the glossy, misleading version that had first drawn us to the neighborhood years earlier. We never actually wrote that brochure, though the idea stuck with me longer than I expected, a reminder of how thoroughly our understanding of community had been reshaped by everything we'd endured and ultimately overcome. Real community, I'd learned, wasn't clipboards and enforced conformity. It was Priya's lemonade, Frank's parking modification, Angela's transparency, Walter's letters. Daniel and I began, cautiously, discussing whether we might eventually want to move somewhere entirely fresh, unburdened by even the improved version of Willowbrook we now inhabited, or whether staying, having genuinely reshaped the community for the better, mattered more than starting over somewhere without any history attached to our name at all. We ultimately decided to stay, at least for now, recognizing that leaving would mean abandoning something we'd fought so hard and so publicly to build. Not just our own ramp, but genuine, lasting change in how Willowbrook operated going forward. Something about that felt more valuable, ultimately, than the clean slate of somewhere entirely new and untouched by history. The community, nearly 3 years removed from Karen's reign, continued evolving steadily under Angela's leadership, welcoming several new families specifically because word had spread about Willowbrook's genuinely transparent, accessible governance. Now, an unexpected reputation shift from the fear-based compliance Karen had once cultivated so carefully during her 11 controlling, unchallenged years running things. I ran into Elena, the young mother I'd helped months earlier, at a community event that spring, her son happily navigating his accessible entrance nearby without a second thought. Exactly the unremarkable normalcy we'd once fought so desperately and expensively to achieve for Daniel. Watching that easy, uneventful moment felt like everything our own fight had ultimately been worth enduring. Renata, checking in occasionally even after her formal involvement ended, mentioned that our case continued getting cited in disability advocacy circles. A small but genuinely meaningful legacy. Neither Daniel nor I had ever intended to create when we'd simply wanted a safe, legal way for him to leave his own front door each morning without fear of tipping sideways into the flowerbed. Daniel, reflecting on everything one quiet evening on our porch, ramp visible and unremarkable in the fading light, said something that captured the entire ordeal better than any legal document or news article ever had. "We just wanted to come home," he said simply.
"Everything else just kind of happened because..."
I agreed completely, recognizing that everything following that first simple, reasonable request, the falsified records, the tampering, the criminal conviction, the broader investigation, Corinne, Elena, Walter's newfound independence, had all grown, unexpectedly, from Karen's stubborn, cruel refusal to allow one disabled man a safe way to leave his own house. Sometimes the smallest injustice, left unchecked and unchallenged, reveals something far larger and more rotten beneath it, given enough persistence, documentation, and refusal to simply give up quietly the way so many others before us apparently had. Karen had counted on exactly that kind of quiet surrender for over a decade. We'd simply refused to provide it. Nearly 3 years to the day since that first denied permit, Daniel wheeled down our ordinary, unremarkable ramp one bright morning, coffee in hand, sunlight catching the aluminum rails that had once represented an entire exhausting battle and now represented simply, quietly, home. I watched him from the porch, and for the first time in years, I felt entirely, completely at peace. Willowbrook's transformation continued steadily in the months that followed, Angela's transparent leadership becoming simply the expected norm rather than a novel relief. New families settling in without ever knowing the neighborhood's darker history under Karen's reign, learning about it only occasionally through Priya's retelling at community gatherings, treated now more as cautionary legend than lived. Ongoing trauma. Corinne and Elena both stayed loosely in touch. An unlikely small network formed entirely from shared, painful experience with institutional discrimination, occasionally exchanging advice or simply checking in on each other's lives. A genuine friendship grown from circumstances none of us would have chosen, but all of us, ultimately, felt strangely grateful to have survived and understood so thoroughly together. Walter's letters continued arriving occasionally, each one a little lighter than the last, describing new friendships, small outings, a life finally reclaimed from years of hidden isolation. I kept every one of them, the strange, Unexpected correspondence born from the very worst period of our lives. Now serving as quiet, ongoing proof that genuine good could grow from even the ugliest circumstances. Karen, for her part, remained largely absent from our daily lives entirely, her name surfacing only rarely now, usually in Priya's updates about property values or Angela's occasional reference to bylaws written specifically to prevent whatever particular abuse Karen had once perfected. She'd become, essentially, a cautionary footnote in the ongoing, improved story of a community she'd once controlled completely. Daniel's ramp remained standing, sturdy and unremarkable, exactly where Karen had once fought so viciously to prevent it, precisely where a legal battle spanning nearly 3 years and multiple states had ultimately concluded. It existed now simply as infrastructure, ordinary and quiet, the way it always should have been allowed to exist from that very first reasonable permit request. I thought, occasionally, about how strange it was that something as simple as a wheelchair ramp had ultimately exposed and dismantled over a decade of hidden institutional discrimination and financial fraud, protected multiple future families, and even helped one hidden, isolated old man finally reclaim his own independence. All because one woman couldn't stand the sight of a ramp she found aesthetically inconvenient. We never forgot what it cost us to get here. 9 months of denial and cruelty. Nearly 3 years of legal fighting. The fear of that loosened bracket. The exhausting weight of documenting every small injustice until it finally, undeniably mattered to someone with real power to act. But standing on our porch now, watching Daniel move freely, it had been worth every bit of it. Willowbrook, imperfect but genuinely improving, continued forward without Karen's shadow looming over every decision, every request, every homeowner simply trying to live safely and comfortably in their own home. That, in the end, was the real victory. Not Karen's downfall specifically, but the ordinary, unremarkable peace that finally, deservedly, replaced it for everyone who remained. The ramp still stands. Pleases. Karen never bothers us again.